The notice arrived on a Tuesday in October of 2009, folded into thirds inside a plain white envelope from the Harlan County Tax Office. Ruth Alderman set it on the kitchen table without opening it for nearly an hour. She stood at the window instead, watching the light move across the hillside in the way it always moved in autumn, slow and sideways, catching the frost on the dead grass, making it shine like something precious before it melted away. She was 76 years old. She had been watching that light for 51 years, ever since she had come to live at this farm as a young bride, and she had learned that things that shone in the morning were not always what they appeared. When she finally opened the envelope, she already knew what it said. The Alderman Quarry property, a 17-acre parcel on the north side of Kettle Creek Road, had accumulated 3 years of unpaid property taxes. The total owed, including penalties and county fees, was $1,092. If the balance was not paid within 90 days, the county would seize the land and place it for sale at public auction. Ruth set the letter down and looked at her bank statement, which she had also left on the table because she had been expecting to need it. Her account held $1,214. The farm mortgage was paid. Her late husband Edward had made sure of that before the cancer took him in 2003. But the pension she lived on was not generous, and the county taxes on the farm itself and the heating oil bill and the cost of keeping the truck running had left her with a margin she measured in weeks, not months. She could pay the quarry tax, but then she would have nothing. Not in an emergency, not in a real one. She sat down in Edward's chair, she still called it that 6 years on, and thought about her father. Victor Alderman had not been a large man. He had been lean and deliberate, with hands that were perpetually dark along the knuckle creases from decades of working stone. He had not talked much. He was a man who preferred to write things down. From the time he first broke ground on the Alderman Quarry in the spring of 1931, when he was 33 years old, and the Great Depression was in full grip, and the land cost him almost nothing, because almost nothing was what most people had. He had kept a ledger, not one ledger, 6 of them, each bound in dark green leather, each with the year range embossed on the spine in gold leaf that had mostly flaked away by the time Ruth inherited them. They sat on the top shelf of the oak cabinet in the corner of the kitchen, 7 inches apart from each other, as orderly in retirement as they had been in use. Ruth had not opened them in 3 years, but she knew exactly what was in them. She had been 9 years old when her father first let her sit in the small plywood office beside the quarry's weighing scale and watch him write. The pen moved in careful block letters, each one the same height as the last. Every line mattered. Nothing was wasted. He wrote the date, the tonnage, the buyer, the price, the depth of the cut, the weather, and whatever observation seemed worth recording. He wrote as though someone would read it later who needed to know what it had actually been like. She stood and took the 4th ledger down from the shelf, the one covering 1958 through 1965. She opened it on the table and found the entry she was looking for without having to search. March 14, 1962. Sold 90 tons to Virginia State Highway Department for Route 7 Bridge Foundation. They argued the price. I told them this price is for stone that does not fail. They were quiet after that. Price per ton $5.80. Ruth closed the ledger. She thought for a long time. Then she picked up the phone on the kitchen wall and called the Harlan County Tax Office to ask when the auction was scheduled. April 14, 2010, 6 months away. She let the property go delinquent. It was the only rational choice given the numbers. But she marked April 14th on the calendar by the refrigerator with a red pen, and she did not speak of it to anyone. The quarry had been shut since 1971. Ruth remembered the day her father closed it. She had been 38 years old, already married, already living on the farm down the road, already accustomed to the idea that the quarry was a permanent feature of the landscape as fixed as the hillside and the creek. Victor had called her that evening and told her in his spare way, said the state had gone to limestone aggregate for the new connector projects, said the price differential was too large to overcome with their operation size, said he was shutting down the crusher for the winter and probably not starting it again. He said it the way he would have said the pump in the South Field had finally given out. A fact to be acknowledged, recorded, and filed, not a grief to be aired. But Ruth had heard what was underneath it in the particular silence that followed his words before he said good night and hung up the phone. 40 years of work ended, not by geological depletion, not by equipment failure, not by any failure of the stone itself, but by a purchasing decision made by men in a building in Richmond who had chosen cheaper over better and had not understood or had chosen not to understand the difference in the long run. The quarry had filled with rainwater slowly over the following decades. The equipment had been sold in 1974, the year after Victor's wife died, when he no longer had the will to maintain what he could not operate. The trees at the rim had grown taller and then begun dying, so that by the late 1990s, the place had the look of a wound half-healed. A dark green water surface surrounded by pale dead wood and the occasional surviving oak that had found enough soil in the rock to persist. Ruth had stopped going there after Victor passed in 1988. The property taxes on 17 acres of flooded pit and dead timber amounted to $364 a year. She paid them without fail for 21 years. Letting them go delinquent felt like a small betrayal, but she had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was clear, and she had a plan. To understand the plan, you have to understand the stone. Victor Alderman had not chosen his land for farming. He had chosen it because of what was underneath the soil in the shelving ledges of exposed rock along the north face of the hill where Kettle Creek made its turn. He had been 19 years old in 1917 when he first walked those acres with his uncle, a man named Warren Alderman, who had worked stone quarries in western Pennsylvania for 20 years, and who stopped at a particular outcrop near the water and said, without preamble, "Feel the weight of that." Victor crouched and broke a fragment loose with the heel of his boot. It was no larger than his fist, gray, dense, with a faint blue undertone that showed when he held it at an angle to the afternoon sun. It was heavier than the limestone he knew from school, heavier than ordinary granite. His uncle said that is hornblende granite. High corundum content. The corundum is what gives it that blue. You don't find this everywhere. In fact, said his uncle, in this part of Virginia, you don't find it anywhere else that I know of. Victor spent the next 14 years working other men's farms and saving his wages and waiting for the land to become available. In 1931, during the worst of the Depression, when the 17 acres on Kettle Creek Road was selling for the price of a good mule, he bought it. He drilled his first core sample with a hand crank rig borrowed from a neighbor and a diamond bit he had sent away from a catalog in Pittsburgh. The rig took 3 days and 2 men to operate. The core came up dark and heavy and smelling of deep earth, the color of a winter sky at dusk. The results were not a surprise to him. They were a confirmation of what his uncle had told him and what his own hands had told him when he first lifted that fragment from the outcrop 14 years before. The stone's water absorption was negligible. He measured it by soaking samples in a bucket through an entire Harlan County winter, weighing them before and after. The mass gain was less than 1%. He tested its hardness by attempting to scratch it with progressively harder materials in the manner his uncle had taught him, working up from a steel file to a carbide chip he had cadged from a machinist in town. He tested its freeze-thaw durability by leaving samples exposed on the north-facing side of the barn wall through 3 consecutive winters, examining them each spring under a jeweler's loupe his wife Eleanor had bought him for his birthday. He found no cracking, no spalling, no surface degradation of any measurable kind. He wrote these results in the first ledger in 1932 in the careful block script he used for everything important. He wrote this stone does not drink water. In a place where the ground freezes hard every winter, a stone that does not drink is a stone that does not break. The state builds roads with limestone because it is cheap. I will not quarry limestone. I will quarry this. He was right about the stone. He was wrong as events proved about the state's ability to understand what it was buying. The Alderman Quarry operated for 39 years, not always profitably, not always smoothly, but consistently. Victor sold crushed aggregate for roadbeds and bridge foundations across 3 counties. His first major contract was in 1934 for the sub-base of the Kettle Creek Bridge, a job that paid him enough to buy the drill rig outright and put a roof on the plywood office. The bridge stood for 70 years without structural failure at its foundation. Victor recorded the contract in the ledger and made a note 3 decades later when the bridge was inspected and found sound. They have not yet found a reason to complain about the stone. He was not by any measure a wealthy man. The quarry provided a living, not a fortune. There were years when the contracts were thin and years when a single county project made up the difference, but the work was honest and the product was real, and Victor Alderman understood both of those things with a clarity that sustained him through the slow years. Thomas, his only son, died of a fever in 1943 at the age of 17. Ruth was the one who stayed. She learned the business from the weighing scale up, spending summers in the quarry office, through her teenage years reading the ledgers the way other girls read magazines. She learned the language of stone, the difference between micaceous granite that would crumble under frost and the blue-hearted hornblende that would outlast the things built on top of it. She learned her father's pricing logic, which was not based on what the market would bear, but on what the stone was actually worth as a material that would perform as promised under the worst conditions that Harlan County winters could produce. When she married Edward Alderman, a distant cousin who had grown up on a farm 12 miles away and who had the same patience and the same relationship to silence as her father, which was perhaps why she chose him, she moved to the farm down the road and began the part of her life that was not the quarry. But the quarry was always there. She helped with the paperwork on weekends and holidays. She knew the deposit as well as her father knew which wall produced the densest stone and which section ran thin toward the eastern property line, knew the sound the crusher made when it was working correctly versus when the jaw plates needed adjustment. When Victor died in 1988 at the age of 89, the quarry had been closed for 17 years. The 6 ledgers were the record of everything it had been. Ruth inherited them along with the farm and the 17 acres, and she paid the taxes without fail, and she did not go there, and she did not stop thinking about what her father had known. On the morning of April 14th, 2010, Ruth arrived at the Harlan County Courthouse 20 minutes before the scheduled start of the auction. She wore a gray wool coat that had belonged to Edward, oversized on her small frame, but warm, the collar worn smooth along the fold. She carried a cloth bag containing a thermos of coffee, her checkbook, and the 4th ledger. She took a seat in the 5th row toward the aisle. The room held about 60 people. Most of them Ruth knew by face, if not by name. The county property auctions in Harlan were a social occasion, as much as a commercial one, an opportunity to see who had fallen into financial difficulty and what might be acquired cheaply by someone paying attention. The mood was conversational in the back rows and businesslike in the front. The professional bidders, men who bought delinquent parcels and resold them within 18 months, sat with their phones and their printed property lists and their expressions of calibrated disinterest. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Bill Curry, who handled county auctions and also sold used farm equipment on weekends, worked through 8 lots before he reached the Alderman property. There were 2 residential parcels, a strip of undeveloped land along the county road that a developer had bought and then abandoned, a storage building with a collapsed roof, and several others that generated modest bidding and modest results. Then Curry reached Lot 9. "All right," he said, shuffling his papers. "Next up, folks. Lot 9, 17.2 acres, zoned industrial, Kettle Creek Road. This is the old Alderman Quarry parcel. It's a water-filled pit, been sitting idle since the early 70s. Minimum bid is the tax liability, $912. Do I have 912? Silence. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone near the back coughed. The quarry parcel was known to everyone in the room, and everyone in the room knew it was a flooded hole in the ground with dead trees around the edge and no conceivable commercial use. The minimum bid was the tax debt, and even that was more than the land was worth in any practical sense. Then Hank Mercer, who ran the scrap operation on Route 6 and had been watching the quarry parcel for 2 years with the low-grade patience of a man who collects things, cheaply raised 2 fingers. "950, he said without enthusiasm. He said it the way a man at an auction says a number he expects to win, with not the way a man says a number he cares about. $950, do I hear 1,000? A pause. Someone in the second row shook his head. The calculation was visible on his face, not worth more than that, not for what it is. Mercer had the thing. Curry moved toward the gavel, already beginning the practiced count in his head. $1,200. The room turned. Ruth Alderman sat in the 5th row with her hand raised, not high, not performing anything, simply making her intention visible to the man at the front. Her face was composed. She did not look at Hank Mercer or at the people around her. She looked at Bill Curry. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. He knew Ruth Alderman. He had lived in Harlan County his whole life, same as she had, and he knew she had let the taxes on that property go delinquent, which meant she had not had the money to pay them. He looked at her coat, which was a man's coat 3 sizes too large, and he made a calculation that was part arithmetic and part something less flattering to him. And he decided that a 76-year-old widow with an empty bank account and a sentimental attachment to her father's name on a flooded hole in the ground was not a person he needed to outbid. He gave a slight shake of his head and looked back at his phone. $1,200. Curry confirmed with the particular note of mild surprise that auctioneers use when the expected outcome changes. Do I hear 1,250, 1,225? He scanned the room with the professional optimism of a man who knows the answer is no. Going once, going twice. He looked once more at Mercer, who did not look up. The gavel came down with a sharp crack on the wooden block. Sold to Ruth Alderman, $1,200. Ruth walked to the clerk's table at the side of the room and wrote the check. The account she drew it from would hold $14 when it cleared. She did not linger. She tucked the receipt into the cloth bag and walked out of the courthouse into the April morning. Eleanor Finch, her neighbor from the farm 3 miles down the road, caught up with her on the courthouse steps. Eleanor was 61 years old, sensible and genuinely concerned. "Ruth, what on earth did you just do?" Ruth adjusted the strap of the cloth bag on her shoulder. "I bought it back." "You bought a flooded pit for $1,200 when you don't have $1,200. "I had $1,214. Ruth looked at her steadily. "I needed the 14 for gas." "That's not funny. You barely have anything in your account. What are you going to do with that property? It's been worthless for 40 years. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "My father knew that land. I know my father." She adjusted the bag again and walked to her truck. It was not an answer exactly, but it was everything she intended to say. The spring and summer of 2010 passed without visible change at the quarry. Ruth visited twice alone both times. She parked on the gravel pullout at the end of the access road and walked the perimeter in her rubber boots, moving carefully around the rim of the water-filled pit. The surface was dark, still the color of steel on a cloudy day. The dead trees at the north rim, had shed their bark and stood white and skeletal against the sky. The surviving oaks along the south edge had leafed out fully and cast a dense shade over the waterline. She stood at the northeast section of the rim for a long time on her second visit, looking at the exposed rock face below the waterline where the original quarrying had cut deepest. Even through the water, the color was visible. The dark charcoal gray, the faint blue cast in the shallow areas where the light reached. Her father's iron-hearted stone. She had not looked at it in more than 20 years, and it was exactly as she remembered. She was not sentimental about what she was looking at. She was methodical. She was thinking about what the stone was worth and about who eventually would need to know it. She drove home, made herself a cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers. She was not waiting for something to happen. She understood in the way that patient people understand things that what she needed was already in motion. She simply could not yet see it from where she stood. What was in motion was 10 miles away and moving toward her with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything. Daniel Cross had been with the Virginia Department of Transportation for 17 years when he was assigned the Route 18 expansion project in the spring of 2010. He was 44 years old, lean and precise, with a manner that was efficient rather than warm, and a professional record that had been up to that point genuinely impressive. He had a master's degree in civil engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He had managed 7 major highway projects in the Northern District. His reports were thorough, his timelines were tight, and his budgets over 17 years had come in within 2% of projection more often than any other project manager in the district. He was not an arrogant man in the way that unpleasant men are arrogant. He was precise in a way that can look like arrogance from the outside, particularly when precision fails, because a precise man who has been wrong looks more wrong than an approximate man who has been wrong because the precision implied a certainty that the outcome has now disproved. The Route 18 expansion was the largest project Cross had been given. 12 miles of new 4-lane divided highway through Harlan County, upgrading the existing 2-lane road that had been a state embarrassment for 2 decades. Approved budget, $31,400,000. Construction timeline, 24 months. It was his name on the project documents. His name in the district's quarterly reports. His name in front of the State Transportation Board when questions were asked. He had done everything correctly. He had commissioned a geological survey of Harlan County from a firm in Richmond that specialized in infrastructure site assessment. The survey was thorough by standard measures. Field teams had covered the county, mapped the rock formations, assessed visible outcrops, and produced a 200-page report with seismic data composition analysis and a ranking of potential aggregate sources by quality, volume, and accessibility. The survey had cost $68,000. The survey's conclusion was that while Harlan County contained granite deposits, none were of sufficient characterized quality or accessible volume for a project of Route 18's scale. Several limestone formations in the eastern part of the county showed moderate promise, but the most practical source for the project's aggregate needs was an established quarry operation, Meridian Aggregates of Lee County, which produced crushed limestone base course at a consistent quality, held full state approval, and could deliver to the project site at $19.50 per ton. The Alderman Quarry site had been addressed in the survey in 3 sentences in a section on small historical operations. The language read, Alderman Quarry, Kettle Creek Road. Harlan ceased operations 1971. Metamorphosed hornblende granite formation surface appraisal indicates moderate density. Site is water-filled and structurally compromised. Insufficient data for characterization as viable commercial source. The survey team had not drilled a core sample at the Alderman site. They had looked at the rim, noted the water, noted the dead trees, noted the historical closure, and moved on. This was not unusual. Abandoned flooded sites on derelict parcels were routinely dismissed at the surface appraisal stage. There was no flagged reason to spend time on it. Cross had accepted the survey's conclusions because the survey was from a credentialed firm with a proven track record, and the conclusions were supported by data he could read in the report. He ran the competitive bidding process for aggregate supply. Meridian Aggregates submitted the strongest bid. Cross awarded the contract in August of 2010 and began mobilizing the construction phase. He drove the Route 18 corridor in September, watching the grading equipment move earth with the precision of a process that had been planned down to the cubic yard. He felt in the particular way that competent professionals feel before outcomes. They have done everything to prepare for that. The project was in good hands, his hands. Hands that had not made a major error in 17 years. He did not know about the winter that was coming. Nobody did in the specific terms that would matter. The forecasts indicated a cold season. They did not indicate what a cold season in Harlan County would mean for porous stone laid under pressure in a roadbed that had not yet had time to settle and drain. The winter of 2010 arrived in Harlan County not gradually but decisively. On November 11th, the temperature dropped from 53 degrees at noon to 17 degrees by 10 o'clock that night, driven by a front that moved through faster than the forecast had suggested. It came with 2.5 inches of freezing rain that coated every surface in a shell of clear ice 1/8 of an inch thick. The fields went rigid. The roads glazed. The bare branches of the trees along Kettle Creek Road held their ice through the following morning, and when the light hit them in the low winter angle of early afternoon, they looked like something cast from glass. The temperature returned to above freezing on November 15th. Then, on November 20th, it dropped again, this time to 11 degrees with wind. Then it rose. Then it dropped harder into the single digits for 4 days in a row in the first week of December. The pattern established itself as something outside the ordinary, not a sustained cold, but a brutal cycle temperatures, swinging 40 and 50 degrees within 24-hour periods, the ground never able to settle into a stable frozen state, always in motion between saturation and ice and back to saturation. For the residents of Harlan County, this was a hard winter that people would talk about for several years. For the Route 18 project, which had completed grading, and the first 3 miles of aggregate base course installation in October, it was something more specific and more damaging. The problem with limestone under those conditions is not a mystery to anyone who understands materials, but it becomes a problem only when the conditions exceed what has been tested for. Limestone is a sedimentary rock formed from ancient marine organisms compressed over millions of years, and its internal structure is laced with microscopic pores that have an affinity for water. Under laboratory freeze-thaw testing, the standard soundness test that every aggregate must pass before state approval limestone performs adequately. The test simulates 5 cycles of immersion and freezing and measures mass loss. Meridian's limestone had passed with a loss of 6.2%. The state maximum was 12. The number was acceptable. The data was correct. The winter of 2010 was not 5 cycles. It was, by the count of a field technician who began tracking it in December 41, freeze-thaw events between November 11th and March 3rd, many of them within the same week, many of them accompanied by rain or snowmelt that forced water deep into the base course before the next freeze drove it deeper still. The aggregate was not experiencing laboratory conditions. It was experiencing a sustained hydraulic assault, and the microscopic pores of the limestone were filling and expanding and refreezing and cracking and filling again in a slow, invisible, patient destruction of everything the stone had been. A field technician named Roy Holt first noticed something wrong on December 18th. He was driving the completed first segment of Route 18 in his DOT pickup doing a routine check when he felt the roadbed give slightly under his tires, in the way that roadbeds do not give when they have been properly compacted and cured. He stopped the truck and got out and pushed the heel of his boot into the shoulder of the aggregate course. It yielded. Not much, but enough to register. He stood there for a moment in the cold, looking at the mark his boot had made, and then he wrote it up as a possible compaction anomaly and called it in. Cross received the report that evening at his desk in the district office. He filed it under anomalies requiring follow-up and went home for dinner because a single compaction report on a newly completed section in an unusual weather event was, by the standards of 17 years of project management, not an emergency. It was a data point. By the middle of January, he had 11 data points. 5 sections of completed roadbed had failed compaction retesting. A 6th was borderline. 2 sections had failed by margins large enough that the numbers could not be explained as testing variability. Cross authorized emergency core sampling of the worst sections. The samples were extracted and sent to the State Materials Lab in Richmond on a Wednesday. He asked for results by Friday. He got them Thursday afternoon. Water absorption rate of the recovered aggregate 49% above the tested baseline. Structural load resistance degraded to below minimum specification. The material was failing from the inside out in a way that the surface showed almost nothing about until weight was applied, at which point the degraded internal structure collapsed under load. The stone that had met every specification in August was not in January the same stone. The winter had changed it. Cross sat at his desk and read the lab report through twice. Then he sat without reading anything for 25 minutes, which was not a thing he was accustomed to doing. The calculation was straightforward and terrible. $940,000 in installed material and labor would have to be excavated and removed. The project was stopped. Standing equipment costs and overhead were running $22,000 a day. The 24-month project timeline was not a timeline anymore. He had no alternative aggregate source because the Geological Survey had told him there was no viable local source, and the survey was the document he had trusted. Shipping aggregate from a distant county would take weeks to arrange, cost more per ton on logistics alone than the entire cost differential he had saved by using limestone, and might not be available in the volumes he needed in the time frame the project demanded. He was by the precise and specific standard of what the word means to a project manager who has put his name on everything in serious trouble. He called an emergency meeting of his engineering team for Monday morning. 7 engineers around a conference table in the district office, the lab results on a laptop screen at the center of the table, the original Geological Survey printed out in front of each chair. The room had the atmosphere of a space where people are present but would prefer not to be. Cross went through the results without softening them. He was not a man who softened things. He said, "We have a material failure. The limestone aggregate is not performing under field conditions. 940 in material and labor needs to come out. We are losing $22,000 a day in standing costs. We need a local source of aggregate that can perform in these conditions, and we need to identify it within 2 weeks." He said, "Go back through the survey and tell me what we have not yet characterized. I want new test cores at every formation in the county that was assessed at the surface level and not drilled. I want the results on my desk in 10 days. The team went to work. They identified 4 locations that had received surface-level assessments in the original survey. Field geologists were dispatched with drill rigs. Over the following 10 days in weather that remained brutal, cores were pulled from a granite formation near the North County line, a basalt seam in the western hills, and 2 additional limestone outcrops that the original survey had noted as moderately promising. The North County granite was micaceous. The mica content created planes of weakness along which the stone would shear under freeze-thaw cycling, making it unsuitable for road-base aggregate regardless of its compressive strength. The basalt seam was genuine and dense, but the deposit was thin 12 to 14 feet at its widest point, not enough to support the tonnage the project needed across 18 months of construction. The alternative limestone outcrops were compositionally similar enough to the meridian material that the results could be predicted adequate under standard conditions, inadequate under the conditions this winter was providing. 3 weeks. Additional testing costs over $50,000. The project now 47 days behind schedule and bleeding over $1 million in total lost costs and continuing overhead. Cross sat in the conference room on a Friday afternoon with his team, and the results spread across the table, and understood that he was running out of options in a county that the survey had told him was geologically unremarkable. It was Sadie Harmon who spoke. Harmon was 26 years old and had been with the Northern District for 11 months assigned from the state's graduate engineering program. She was slight and precise in her speech, with a habit of thinking visibly before she said anything, which meant there was often a pause before her sentences that made people underestimate what was coming. Cross had assigned her to review the original geological survey for missed details, a task that was both genuine and peripheral genuine, because someone needed to do it peripheral because nobody expected the survey to have missed anything significant. She had been quiet through the first part of the meeting. When Cross finished going through the most recent results, she said, "The Alderman Quarry entry in the original survey concerns me." Cross looked at her. "It's a flooded site, abandoned since '71. The survey rated it insufficient for characterization based on a surface appraisal," Harmon said. They noted the formation type as metamorphosed hornblende granite and recorded what they called a moderate density indicator from the visible outcrop, but they didn't drill. The phrase in the survey is insufficient data for characterization as viable commercial source. She paused. That phrase means they don't know. It doesn't mean the source isn't viable. It means they didn't determine whether it was. The site is waterlogged and structurally compromised, their exact words. Their exact words about the limestone were that it exceeded specifications in all laboratory categories, Harmon said quietly. That was also accurate. The room was very still. Cross looked at her for several seconds. She held his gaze without difficulty, which he registered as a small piece of information about her. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a junior person in a professional setting says something accurate and uncomfortable, and everyone present is waiting for authority to determine how to receive it. Cross was aware of what the silence meant. He was also aware that Harmon was right. The survey had been the foundation of his confidence in the limestone, and the foundation had proved inadequate, and sitting across from him was a person who had read the survey carefully enough to identify a gap that he himself had not examined. How dewatered would the site need to be to get a drill footing? He asked. Enough to stabilize a 6x6 area at the northeast rim based on the survey's topology notes. 2 days of pumping with a standard dewatering rig should accomplish it. Get a crew out there. I want the largest core they can pull. Results on my desk by end of week. Duh. The drill crew arrived at the Alderman Quarry on a Tuesday morning. There were 3 of them, a foreman named Pete Garland, and 2 crew members operating a truck-mounted core rig and a centrifugal pump. They ran the pump for the first 2 days, pulling water from the northeast corner of the pit until they had a stable enough footing to position the rig. The water was very dark, cold as iron, and came out at a rate that suggested the pit was deeper at that corner than the surface area implied. On the 3rd morning, with the footing established and the rig positioned against the exposed rock face, Garland started the drill. He had been drilling cores for 19 years in 4 states. He knew by the sound and the feel of the rig through his feet and hands what was happening in the ground below him before the core came up. Soft formations made a low, grinding murmur, a sound like a heavy door dragged across a wood floor. Standard granite made a higher whine with periodic chatter as the bit found harder inclusions. Limestone came cleanly, relatively fast, the bit eating through it, with a confidence that was, in retrospect, perhaps misleading. The alderman stone made a sound he had not heard before. It was high and sustained a thin, screaming note that the rig held from the moment the bit engaged and did not vary. The rate of penetration was half what he expected for granite. The rig was shaking differently, the vibration more focused, more regular, as though the bit were meeting the same resistance at every point, rather than varying as formations usually varied. He stood next to it with his arms crossed and said nothing, but he was paying attention in the way that people pay attention when something does not behave as expected. They pulled a 9-foot core, even covered in gray stone powder, and the dark, cold mud of the quarry bottom, even before it was cleaned or dried, it was visibly different from anything Garland had pulled that month or the month before. The color was wrong for the kind of gray he expected. It was darker, a deep charcoal shot through with a faint blue cast that showed in the low winter light when you moved it slowly in your hands. The weight was wrong. He had his crew member hold one end while he lifted the other, and they looked at each other across the length of it. Because it was heavier than 9 feet of granite, had any right to be by a margin you could feel in your forearms. The core was boxed, labeled, and driven to the State Materials Lab in Richmond the same afternoon. Cross arrived at his desk at 6:45 on a Thursday morning, 2 days after the core had been delivered. The results were in his email sent by the lab at 11 the previous night. He read the water absorption figure first. It was the number he cared most about given what the winter had done to the limestone. The Meridian limestone had been rated at 0.31% absorption under standard testing. The state maximum was 0.5. The alderman sample read 0.07%. He read it again. It was less than 1/4 of the Meridian baseline. It was less than 1/7 of the state maximum. He had never seen a water absorption figure that low for aggregate in a field core. He had seen numbers that low in academic papers describing theoretical ideal materials. He read the soundness test result. Mass loss after 5 freeze-thaw cycles 0.9%. Maximum allowed 12%. The limestone had failed at 6.2 under laboratory conditions before the field conditions had even been applied to it. This stone had lost less than 1% under the same test. He read the Los Angeles abrasion value. This test measured hardness and resistance to degradation under impact loading, simulating the mechanical stress of road use. The value for the alderman sample 16. The state maximum was 40. Anything under 25 was considered strong. Anything under 20 was exceptional. He set the paper down. He picked it up. He read all 3 numbers again. Then he sat with both hands flat on the desk, looking at the wall across from him, and thought about a 200-page geological survey that had described this formation in 3 sentences, and moved on. The survey had been conducted by credentialed professionals with standard equipment and established protocols. They had made a reasonable decision not to drill an abandoned waterlogged site with no visible commercial interest. The decision was defensible. The outcome of that decision was sitting in front of him in 3 numbers that told him the best aggregate in Harlan County. Possibly the best aggregate he had ever seen. Test data for, in 17 years of road construction, had been sitting 60 feet underwater in a flooded quarry on a derelict 17-acre parcel that his agency had dismissed in 2 sentences. He looked up the property owner in the county records. The entry showed a transfer from Harlan County seized for tax delinquency to Ruth M. Alderman, dated April 2010. Purchase price, $1,200. He sat with that for a while. Then he wrote down the address associated with the parcel and went home to think about how to have the conversation he was going to have. Then, he drove to the quarry first alone on the Saturday before he went to see her. He wanted to stand at the rock face before he stood in her kitchen because he believed that you should look at the thing you are going to talk about before you talk about it. The crew had left the northeast corner dewatered enough that the rock face was exposed for about 12 feet of height. He stood at the base of it in his work boots and looked at it for a long time. The color in the morning light was what the lab data had implied it would be. Dark, dense, almost black in the shadow, and then that blue undertone when the winter sun caught it at an angle, cold and clear and specific. He reached out and put his palm flat against the face of it. It was cold and absolutely unyielding. There was something about the weight of it, the density you could feel without picking it up, simply from the way it occupied space, that was different from the ordinary materiality of stone. It felt like something that had been waiting. He drove home and spent the rest of the weekend preparing for a conversation. He had no experience with going to a person he had never met on land. His own agency had formally declared worthless, to ask her to help him repair a disaster that his data had told him would not happen. He drove to Ruth Alderman's farm on a Monday morning in February, arriving at 9 o'clock. The house was small and white, with a front porch that ran the full width of the face, a woodpile stacked in an interlocking pattern against the south wall with the care of someone who intended it to stay there, and a truck in the yard that was older than his own but clearly maintained. He sat in the state-issued sedan for a moment before getting out. He was aware that he was nervous in the way that competent people are nervous when they have to acknowledge failure to someone who did not fail. Ruth Alderman opened the door before he reached the porch steps. She had seen him pull in. She was small, composed, with the kind of stillness that belongs to people who are accustomed to working alone and thinking without interruption. She wore a dark blue cardigan over a plaid work shirt, both of which were clean and neither of which was new. She looked at him with an expression that was not curious and not hostile and not welcoming in the conventional sense. She looked at him the way people look at things they have been expecting. He introduced himself. He told her his name and his title and the name of the project. He told her about the Route 18 expansion, the approved budget, the timeline. He told her about the limestone failure calmly and without minimizing it, because he had decided on the drive over that he was not going to perform competence in a situation where he had demonstrably failed and where she would know it before he finished the sentence. He told her about the geological survey and the fact that her quarry had not been drilled. He told her about Sadie Harmon, the young engineer who had noticed the gap in the survey's characterization. He told her about the drill crew and the core sample. He told her the numbers. She listened without interrupting, which was not the same as listening passively. She was present in the way that people who have been waiting a long time are present when the thing they have been waiting for finally arrives, which is not with excitement, but with the steady attention of someone who has prepared. "You'd better come in," she said. The kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and wood smoke from the stove in the corner. The oak table was large for the room, solid, the surface worn smooth by decades of use. In the center of the table, placed squarely, was a green leather ledger lying open. Cross noticed it as he sat down, but did not look at it directly because she had not invited him to look at it. She set a mug of coffee in front of him without asking if he wanted one, which he interpreted correctly as a gesture that established the terms. She was in her house, and she was being hospitable, and he was a guest, and those facts were not in dispute. He wrapped both hands around the mug. He told her what he needed. He told her the quantities, the timeline, the urgency. He told her that the state was prepared to pay a fair market price for the aggregate rights, and he told her the number he had prepared to offer, $16 per ton. He said it was above the regional average for crushed granite aggregate. He said it was a strong offer, and that at 14,000 tons for the initial emergency order alone, it represented more than $220,000, with potential for significantly more if the full project procurement went through her quarry. He said the word $220,000 and waited for the response that number usually produced, which was a certain kind of alertness in people who had not expected it. Ruth Alderman looked at the open ledger in front of her. Her right hand rested on the open page, not covering it, but touching it, her fingers along the edge. She did not look at Cross for a moment. She seemed to be reading something or remembering something in the way that people do when a thing they know is being confirmed by something happening in front of them. "What did my father sell to the state in 1962? She asked. Cross said, "I don't have that." $5.80 per ton, she said. That was his price. They argued about it. He told them this price is for stone that does not fail. She paused. What is $16 in 1962 money? Cross did not know the exact figure but knew it was substantially more in real terms than 580, and he began to say so, but she continued before he could frame the sentence. My father sold stone to this state for 40 years, she said. Good stone, better stone than anything the state has used since they stopped buying from him. He knew what it was worth. He wrote it down. She looked at the ledger. They told him his price was too high. They stopped buying from him and went to limestone because it was cheaper by $3 a ton, and they used that limestone in a bridge abutment on Route 12 and in the subbase of the old connector, and if you looked at both of those structures carefully, you would find the limestone sections, and you would find that they have not held the way the alderman sections held. She looked up at him. He was right about the stone. He was right about the price. The state knew it and chose to forget it. Cross said nothing. I am not interested in the regional average for aggregate, she said. I am interested in a fair price. Mrs. Alderman, $16 per ton is, my price, she said, is $85 per ton. The number landed in the room with a specific kind of weight. Cross heard it and understood it the way you understand a number that is not a negotiating position, but a statement of fact about how the speaker understands the situation. He had been in procurement negotiations for 17 years. He knew the difference between a person who opens high to leave room to move and a person who tells you a price. This was the second kind. He started to explain. He said the words state budget and procurement regulations and regional standard and competitive bidding requirements. He said the number was more than 4 times the regional average. He said there were statutes governing emergency procurement that imposed ceilings on above-market pricing. He said it as clearly and professionally as he could, because he believed that clarity and professionalism were the appropriate tools for the situation. Ruth Alderman listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she said, You are not buying stone. He waited. You are buying a solution to a $31 million problem, she said. You are buying 14,000 tons of material that will not fail in the winter conditions your current material has already failed in. You are buying a road that will be standing in 20 years and in 40 years, and that the state will not have to repair in 5. She turned the ledger on the table so that he could see the open page, and she rested her finger beside a circled figure in the margin. My father wrote that note in the early 1960s. He wrote the price he was charging, and he wrote the calculation of what that stone was worth, not as an aggregate commodity, but as a performance guarantee, as insurance against failure. The price he calculated was higher than what he charged because he was a fair man and not a greedy one. She looked at him. $85 is not what the stone costs. It is what the solution costs. If you would like to go find another solution, you are welcome to do that. Cross looked at her for a long time. He was thinking about the alternatives analysis his team had produced, and about the 47 days of accumulated delay, and about the $22,000 burning every day the project sat idle. He was thinking about the 3 numbers in the lab report. He was thinking also about the ledger in front of him and what it represented. Not a sentimental old woman with an inflated sense of her father's legacy, but a person who had grown up reading decades of precise observation about a material she understood better than anyone who had come after her, and who had sat with that knowledge for 42 years and paid property taxes on it and waited. He said, I need to discuss this with my supervisor and with the state procurement office. I'll need to file an emergency justification for above-market pricing. I understand that, she said. I'll expect to hear from you. She said it the way people say things when they are not asking. Cross drove back to Harlan in the kind of silence that follows conversations that have changed the frame of something. He was not angry. He was in a precise way that he would think about for a long time afterward, recalibrated. The woman he had sat across from was not what any part of his preparation had anticipated. He had gone in expecting to negotiate with sentiment and had found himself in a room with knowledge. He spent 2 days working through the alternatives one more time, not because he expected to find something different, but because he was required professionally to exhaust the options before going to procurement with a justification for an off-scale price. He called the other suppliers. He ran the numbers on shipping from Lee County. He asked Sadie Harmon to model the cost of continuing the project delay at various scenarios. Harmon sent him the spreadsheet at 6 in the morning the following day. She had run 3 scenarios, continuing delay with no new aggregate source for 6 weeks partial resolution, using inadequate local material, requiring retesting and likely re-excavation, and full resolution using the Alderman aggregate at the price requested. The comparison was not close. The first scenario added $1.3 million in sunk costs. The second was worse. The third was more expensive per ton than anything the state had ever paid for aggregate in the district's history, and was by the arithmetic of the specific situation the project was in the cheapest option available. Cross took the lab results, the alternatives analysis, and Harmon's cost modeling to his supervisor on a Friday afternoon. He presented it without framing, without spin, without anything other than the numbers and what the numbers said. His supervisor read the lab results for a long time. Then he asked what the price was. Cross told him. His supervisor asked him if he had looked for alternatives. Cross told him about the 2 days of calls and the modeled scenarios. His supervisor was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Get me a written justification for emergency procurement waiver, and I'll take it to the Attorney General's office." He said it the way supervisors say things when they understand that the situation is what it is and the question is no longer whether but how. Cross drove back to Ruth Alderman's farm on a Thursday morning, 8 days after the first visit. It was a clear, cold day, the sky a flat blue frost still on the grass at 9 o'clock. He sat in the car for a shorter time before getting out. He had thought about what he needed to say, and he had thought about how to say it, and now the saying was the part that remained. She opened the door before he reached the steps. She had seen him coming down the road. "I looked for another source," he said. "I know," she said. There was no satisfaction in it. She let him in and set coffee on the table without asking. He sat in the same chair. The ledger was not on the table this time. The table was clean except for 2 mugs. He told her the state would meet the price. He told her the initial order was 14,200 tons at $85 per ton. He told her the check would be certified and delivered by state courier upon signing of the contract. He told her the procurement office had approved the emergency waiver and that the contract would be structured to allow for additional orders subject to separate authorization, and that based on the project's total aggregate requirements and the performance data from the core sample, he expected additional orders to follow. Then he told her that the state's Attorney General's Land Division had reviewed the proposed restoration covenant and had approved it in principle pending final contract language. He said this carefully because he wanted her to understand that he had not agreed to it without getting it confirmed, and that he had gotten it confirmed and that it would hold. Ruth listened to all of it with her hands around her coffee mug and her eyes on his face. "The quarry," he said, "when the extraction is complete, the restoration, the deed transfer to the county, and the name. The county records and all future public documentation will designate the parcel as the Alderman family quarry. That covenant will be attached to the deed transfer and will bind any future owner or administrator." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "When can your crew be here?" "Monday morning, 7 o'clock. I'll have the gate open." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. Outside, a crow called from somewhere in the dead trees at the edge of the property, 2 sharp notes, and then quiet. "Mrs. Alderman," he said, and he said it with something in his voice that was not part of any professional vocabulary he had used before. "For the record, your father should have had his name on something a long time ago." She looked at him across the table. It was a long, specific look, the kind that holds something that words would diminish. Then she said, He had his name on the ledgers. That was enough for him. She paused. It wasn't enough for me, she said. Oh. The crew arrived Monday at 10 minutes to 7. Ruth was already at the gate when the first truck turned off Kettle Creek Road. She had gotten up at 5, made coffee and oatmeal, put on Edward's coat against the February cold, and walked to the gate in the dark to open the lock. She wanted to be there when they came. She did not want to watch from the kitchen window. The operation that followed over the next 9 months was the largest physical undertaking the quarry had seen since Victor Alderman had run it in the 1950s. The extraction company cross-contracted, brought in equipment scaled to the emergency, a portable rock crusher that arrived in sections on 3 flatbed trailers and was assembled at the northwest edge of the property over 2 days, a fleet of haul trucks that moved in and out on a rotation that kept the access road busy from 6 in the morning until after dark, a pump system to manage the continuing water intrusion in the deeper sections of the pit. The drilling and blasting was done with careful attention to the northeast wall, which was where Victor's ledgers had said the stone was purest and deepest. The blast crews worked from his notes without knowing they were doing so. Cross had shown the relevant sections of the ledger to the geological assessment team before extraction began, not because he was required to, but because the notes were accurate and the accuracy mattered. The lead geologist on the extraction team read the 1932 entry about the deposit's extent, compared it to the core sample data, and said, "Your 80-year-old source was more thorough than our survey." The stone came out of the northeast wall exactly as the core data had predicted. Dark, heavy, impervious. The crusher reduced it to the specified gradation with a regularity that the crusher operator noted in his daily logs. This material is consistent. Every ton the same. The haul trucks carried it to the Route 18 project site where it was placed and compacted in the failed sections that had been excavated and then in the sections beyond as the project continued forward. The winter of 2011 continued its cycle of freezing and thawing through March. The repaired sections held. The new sections held. The DOT's field technicians, who had become accustomed to checking core samples every 2 weeks, found no degradation, no softening, no compaction, anomalies. The numbers were what they had been in the lab. The stone did not change under the conditions that had destroyed everything cheaper. By June, the project was moving again. The delay that had seemed catastrophic in February was being partially recovered. The timeline had been reset. The completion date was pushed back, but not indefinitely. Cross made his case to the district board for the additional aggregate order from the Alderman quarry, and the board approved it on the strength of the field performance data. Additional orders followed through the summer and fall of 2011. The certified check for the initial order, $1,207,000, drawn on a state account and made payable to Ruth M. Alderman, was delivered by a state courier to the Alderman farm on a Tuesday in October. The courier was a young man who had been told to get a signature and a receipt. He was not prepared for the fact that the woman who answered the door was 77 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and wore a man's wool coat over a work shirt. He presented the envelope with the formality the situation seemed to require. Ruth signed the receipt, took the envelope, and thanked him. She closed the door, sat down at the kitchen table, opened the envelope, and looked at the check. She sat with it for a while, not long because she was not a person who sat with things when there were other things to do, but long enough to let the reality of it settle into a form she could think about clearly. Then she put it back in the envelope, put the envelope in the oak cabinet next to the ledgers, and put on her coat and drove to the quarry. The operation was in full swing at 11 in the morning. The crusher was running a constant low thunder that she could feel in her chest before she heard it. Trucks moved in a slow, heavy procession up the gravel access road loaded with dark stone. The northeast wall was visible above the waterline, now exposed by months of extraction, showing its true extent for the first time since her father's operation had worked it in the 1960s. It was wider and deeper than anyone had characterized it. Victor's estimate in the 1932 ledger, which he had called conservative, had been correct. Ruth stood at the rim for a few minutes. The stone was exactly what her father had said it was, exactly what she had known it to be for 40 years. It had not needed her to be right about it. It had been right on its own in the dark under the water through all the decades when nobody was paying attention. She had simply been the one who remembered. She drove home and called Eleanor Finch. "I want to do something about the church roof," she said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Ruth, that's going to cost $40,000–50,000 at a minimum. The damage in the back section—" "I know. Who do I call to get started?" She did not move to a larger house. She did not buy a new vehicle, although the truck was beginning to cost her more in repairs than it was worth to keep. She did not take a trip anywhere. She did not invest the money in anything that was designed to produce more money, except in the specific and conservative way that her financial advisor, a man named James Terrell, who had worked with Edward before the cancer and who understood what kind of advice was appropriate for this family, structured the principle to generate reliable returns. The church roof was the first expenditure. The estimate came in at $44,000. Ruth wrote a check from the account and told the contractor to begin as soon as the weather allowed. The congregation voted to install a commemorative plaque in the back of the nave, and Ruth called the minister and asked him not to do that. She was not interested in the plaque. She was interested in a roof that did not leak on the people sitting beneath it. The minister, who was a thoughtful man, said, "Is there anything you'd like us to acknowledge?" "No," Ruth said. "It's a roof. It doesn't need acknowledging. It needs to keep the rain out." He laughed at that, a genuine laugh, and Ruth allowed herself a small smile on her end of the phone. The scholarship was the second expenditure, and it required more planning. She called Harlan County High School and asked to speak with whoever was in charge of academic awards. The conversation went through 3 people before she reached the principal, a woman who had grown up in the county and who knew the alderman name from the quarry and from the Route 7 bridge, and from the kind of accumulated local knowledge that schools carry in the same way families carry it. Ruth told her what she wanted to do: establish a permanent endowed scholarship for students pursuing geology, civil engineering, or material science. She wanted it to pay out indefinitely, the principal untouched interest applied annually. She had worked out the mathematics with James Terrell. An endowment of $175,000 invested conservatively would generate a scholarship of approximately $6,000 to $8,000 per year in perpetuity. The principal was very quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mrs. Alderman, are you certain about this?" "I wouldn't have called if I weren't," Ruth said. The scholarship was named the Victor Alderman Memorial Scholarship in Geology and Engineering. It was awarded for the first time in June of 2012 to a 17-year-old boy from the north part of the county who wanted to study civil engineering at Virginia Tech. Ruth attended the award ceremony. She sat in the 3rd row and watched the boy receive an envelope that contained a check written on a fund that bore her father's name. She did not speak at the ceremony. She clapped when the boy's name was called. Walking out afterward, Eleanor Finch, who had come with her, said, "Your father would have been—" "Yes," Ruth said, "he would." That was enough. She paid the property taxes on both the farm and the quarry parcel forward by 20 years, a lump sum arrangement that James Terrell structured as a prepaid liability with the county. She replaced the truck with a used one 3 years old that she paid for in cash. She had the well pump on the farm replaced, which it had needed for 2 years. She paid for the installation of a new boiler for the heating system, which Edward had been deferring for the last 4 years of his life, and which she had continued to defer because deferral was a habit that outlasted the reasons for it. The rest she invested without drama or ceremony in the instruments that James Terrell recommended and that her own common sense confirmed were appropriate for a woman of 77 who had no desire for risk and no need for excitement. The quarry operation continued through the fall of 2011 and into 2012. By the time the final extraction order was complete, the northeast wall had yielded a total of 87,000 tons of aggregate over 3 separate procurement contracts. The final certificate of extraction was issued in the spring of 2013, and Ruth signed the deed transfer to Harlan County the following June. The County Parks Department oversaw the restoration. The dewatering equipment was removed. The water was allowed to return to its natural level, fed by the springs at the base of the northeast wall and the regular contribution of Kettle Creek through its subsurface connection to the pit. The water took most of a year to return to the level Victor Alderman had seen when he first walked the property in 1917. The walls of the pit had changed. The northeast face was now raw and gray and deeply cut, the evidence of extraction clear and without apology. But the water that filled back in was clear, very cold, fed by the same deep aquifer that had always been there. The wooden sign at the entrance was installed in October of 2013. It read, "Alderman Family Quarry, Harlan County Nature Preserve, established 1931. The county used a plain wooden post and routed letters, nothing elaborate. Ruth drove out to look at it when Eleanor called to say it was up. She sat in the truck at the entrance for a while, engine off, looking at the sign. Then she got out and stood in front of it. The letters were clear and even. The name was right. She thought of her father standing at the outcrop with Warren Alderman in 1917, 19 years old, feeling the weight of the stone in his hand. She thought of the first ledger entry in 1932, the careful block script, the price and the date and the observation. She thought of the last entry in 1971, which she had memorized 40 years ago without intending to, shutting down for winter. The state has chosen cheaper. I have noted it here. The stone is not diminished by the choice. Victor Alderman had been right. The stone was not diminished. It had waited in the dark under the water for 40 years, and when the world finally needed what it offered, it was exactly what it had always been. She got back in the truck and drove home to make dinner. The Route 18 expansion was completed in the spring of 2013, 14 months behind the original schedule. The sections built on Alderman Aggregate, which comprised in the end the entire 12-mile corridor, were assessed in a post-construction survey in 2014. The survey found that the base course was performing at a level that exceeded design specifications by a margin the survey team characterized in their written report as exceptional under continued field conditions. The frost heave rating for the Alderman sections was the lowest recorded for any comparable highway construction in the district in 20 years. The sections that had been repaired after the limestone failure, the $940,000 worth of excavation and replacement, showed no recurrence of degradation through 3 additional winters. The repaired sections and the new sections performed identically, which is to say they performed very well. Daniel Cross filed his project completion report in June of 2013. The report was thorough, as his reports always were, and it included a section on lessons learned that was more candid than the standard format required. He described the aggregate failure, the limitations of surface-only geological assessment, and the significance of ground truth verification as a complement to survey data. He recommended revisions to the district's geological assessment protocols that would require core sampling at any site proposed as an aggregate source, regardless of surface indicators or historical status. He recommended that the district develop procedures for integrating long-term observational records, quarry logs, operational histories, community knowledge into site assessment. The recommendation was adopted. It became part of the district's standard operating procedures in 2014 under a protocol that Cross pushed for and named in internal documents the Ground Truth Verification Standard. He did not attach a story to it in those documents. The story was not relevant to the protocol. What was relevant was the principle that the data you have is not always the data you need, and that the gap between what a survey characterizes and what the ground actually contains is sometimes occupied by knowledge that does not appear in seismic charts, but that has been patiently and precisely recorded by people who lived with the material for decades. Cross became known in the Virginia DOT as a rigorous advocate for that principle. Engineers who worked with him after 2013 noticed that he asked more questions about local knowledge than was typical for a project manager of his seniority. He asked about old-timers, about family operations that had closed, about institutional memory in places where the surveys were thin. He asked those questions because he had been in a kitchen in Harlan County in February of 2011 and had read 14 lines from a 1932 ledger and had understood that the most accurate geological assessment of that quarry had been written by a man with a hand-crank drill and a jeweler's loop who had paid attention over 40 years and written it down. He never described it in exactly those terms in a professional setting, but Sadie Harmon knew that was what it was because she had been in the room for part of it and had watched his face while he read. Harmon completed her master's degree in engineering geology at Virginia Tech in 2016. Her thesis examined the underutilization of historical operational records in aggregate characterization for infrastructure projects. The opening chapter used the Route 18 case study as its primary example, tracing the failure of the Geological Survey's surface assessment, the winter failure of the limestone aggregate, and the properties of the Alderman stone, as documented in Victor Alderman's ledgers from 1932 through 1971. She had asked Ruth Alderman's permission to use the ledgers as source material. Ruth had granted it and had let Harmon spend 2 afternoons at the kitchen table reading through all 6 volumes. Harmon took careful notes and transcribed the most technically relevant entries in full. She left both afternoons with the sense of having read something that mattered in a way that could not be entirely captured in a thesis citation. Her thesis advisor, a professor of engineering geology named Marion Albrecht, who had been teaching at Virginia Tech for 26 years, told Harmon that the Alderman case study was the most compelling illustration of its kind she had encountered in a student paper. She said the argument is not original. The undervaluation of long-term observational knowledge is well documented in the literature, but the specificity of the case makes it real in a way that general arguments don't achieve. Harmon said, "I know. The case study isn't mine. I just recognized it." She went on to work in structural geology with a focus on infrastructure materials assessment. She published 4 papers in the 5 years after her degree, 2 of which cited the Alderman case study. The second citation in a paper on freeze-thaw damage in highway-based courses published in a national engineering journal in 2019 brought the Alderman quarry story to an audience beyond Harlan County. The paper was assigned in 3 university civil engineering programs within a year of publication. Victor Alderman, who had been a man who preferred to write things down, would not have found this surprising. Ruth Alderman died on a February morning in 2017 at the age of 83 at the farm on Kettle Creek Road. She had not been ill in any protracted or dramatic way. She had been 76 in the kitchen with the tax notice and the ledger and the decision to let the land go delinquent and save the $1,200 for the auction, and then she had been 83, and the winter had been a cold one, and she had not felt well for a week, and then she had gone quietly and completely in the chair by the kitchen window, the one that faced east, toward the hillside, where the morning light came in sideways in autumn and made the frost on the dead grass shine. Eleanor Finch found her at 9:30 that morning. She had come to return a jar of jam and to check in as she did most mornings, because the habit had been established over the years in the way that good habits are established between neighbors gradually without announcement until it is simply what happens. Eleanor called the county. She called the minister. She stood in the kitchen for a while in the quiet of it and looked at the oak cabinet and the 6 green leather ledgers on the top shelf. She had known about them all her life, the way you know about things that belong to a place without quite understanding what they contain. She took the 4th ledger down and opened it to a page near the middle, the way you open a book you have meant to read for years. The block script was clear and precise, the entries dated and specific. She read 3 entries and understood standing in the kitchen in the cold February morning why Ruth had bought back a flooded pit for $1,200 and why it had been enough. The funeral service was held at the church, which had a new roof. The building was full. The minister spoke for 20 minutes. He told the story of the quarry, the auction, the winter, the lab results, the price. He told it well because Ruth had told it to him once in the spare and accurate way she told things, and he had listened carefully. He said it was a story about faith in things you know to be true when the world has moved on to cheaper alternatives. He said it was a story about patience. The people of Harlan County, who had been at the auction in 2010, who had watched a woman in an oversized coat pay $1,200 for a flooded hole in the ground and had pitied her or laughed or shaken their heads. Those people sat in the pews and understood what the minister meant in a way that went past the words. They knew what the ledgers were. They knew what the stone was. They knew that the knowledge Ruth had carried had not come from anywhere dramatic or sudden. It had come from a childhood spent watching her father write things down, and from a lifetime of paying attention to what he had written, and from the particular stubbornness of a woman who understood that a thing can be true even when the world has decided it isn't valuable. Her estate was handled by James Terrell, who had been managing her finances for 14 years. The scholarship endowment was in good order and generating returns above the original projection. The farm was left to a great-niece who had visited twice in the last decade and who drove down from Richmond in March to see it and stood in the kitchen looking at the oak cabinet for a long time before she opened it. The 6 ledgers were donated to the Harlan County Historical Society at the end of the year, as Ruth's will specified. They were cataloged by an archivist named Sarah Dunmore, who spent 3 days with them before filing them. Her catalog entry read, Alderman Victor Quarry, Operational Records, 1931 through 1971, 6 volumes. Condition excellent. Content complete. Operational records including transaction logs, geological observations, equipment, records, weather data, and extended technical commentary. Extraordinary detail and precision throughout. Recommend for study. Beside the entry in a different ink, because she had thought about it for a day before writing it, she added, primary source for understanding the material properties and geological character of the Harlan County Hornblende Granite Formation. The author was not a geologist by training. He was something more specific, a man who had paid attention to one piece of land for 40 years and written down what he learned. The Alderman Family Quarry. Nature Preserve received 412 visitors in its first full year of operation, a number the County Parks Department considered strong for a rural preserve in the northern part of the county. The walking path around the rim was widened and resurfaced in 2015, and a 3rd bench was added at the north end facing east, from which you could see the full extent of the northeast wall and the depth of the water below it. A small interpretive panel was installed at the entrance in 2016 with a brief history of the quarry and the Alderman family. The panel included a photograph of Victor Alderman standing at the weighing scale in 1948, taken by his wife Eleanor. He was lean and precise, with his hands at his sides and his eyes looking at something to the left of the camera, as if something more interesting than being photographed was happening nearby. He looked like a man who would rather be working. The caption beneath the photograph read, Victor Alderman, 1898 to 1988. Founder Alderman Quarry established 1931. In the summers, children swim in the quarry. The water is very cold and very clear, fed by the deep springs that run along the base of the northeast wall, the same springs that kept the deposit at the ambient temperature that preserved it through the decades of inactivity. The clarity of the water comes from the impermeability of the stone. No particulate bleeds from the walls. No mineral contamination clouds the surface. The stone does not give anything back to the water. It is as pure and impervious in a swimming hole as it was under a highway. The children who swim there do not know the numbers. They do not know 0.07% water absorption or a Los Angeles abrasion value of 16 or the sodium sulfate soundness rating that shattered the state specification. They know that the water is cold and clear and that the deep end is very deep, and that the old stone walls of the quarry catch the afternoon light in a way that makes them look almost blue. That is also something to know. Victor Alderman had called it iron-hearted stone, but in the light it held a quality that iron does not have, that faint specific blue that came from the corundum content, the trace mineral that had no practical significance in the laboratory analyses, but that made the stone look in the right angle of afternoon sun as though it were lit from within. His daughter had known what she was buying when she wrote the check for $1,200. She had been buying the truth that her father had spent 40 years establishing the truth that the world had set aside in favor of cheaper alternatives, and that she had kept the taxes on for 21 years and bought back for $1,200 and then held until the world needed it again. What she had not known or had not said was that she had also been buying the name on the sign, the name in the county records, the name in the deed covenant that Daniel Cross had taken to the Attorney General's office and that had been approved without objection, because the state, when it examines such things carefully, generally recognizes a fair request. Alderman family quarry. Victor's name on the stone he found. His name on the place where children swim in clear, cold water in the summers. His name in Sadie Harmon's thesis. His name in the endowment at the high school. His name on the scholarship that had, by 2020, sent 11 students from Harlan County to study geology and engineering at universities around the state, some of whom would eventually make decisions about roads and bridges and the materials beneath them. Ruth had told Eleanor on the courthouse steps in April of 2010, "My father knew that land. I know my father." That was the whole of it. That was the plan she had carried from the tax notice to the auction to the check to the kitchen table where she sat across from a man who had come to her in the winter when everything his data had told him had failed, and where she had told him the price was not for the stone but for the solution, and where she had been right, in the way her father had been right, specifically, demonstrably, permanently right, in a manner that did not require argument, because the stone itself was the argument, and the stone had already spoken. In the spring of 2018, Daniel Cross drove back to Harlan County. He had retired from the DOT the previous December after 25 years of service, the last 5 of which had been spent advocating for the protocols that he and Harmon and the Route 18 failure had put in place. He drove without a particular destination, just the county roads he had known for 20 years, through the flat farmland south of town and up toward the hills north of Kettle Creek. He turned off the main road onto Kettle Creek Road and drove past the Alderman farm. The house was occupied. Smoke came from the chimney and a different truck stood in the yard. He slowed, but did not stop. He drove another quarter-mile and turned onto the gravel access road at the entrance to the preserve. He parked and got out. The wooden sign was weathered now, the letters still clear. Alderman Family Quarry, Harlan County Nature Preserve, established 1931. He walked the path to the northeast rim and stood at the edge. The water below was dark and still in the morning, very clear, the walls of the quarry visible down into the depths until the light gave out. The northeast face was still raw, where the extraction had cut deep, the stone exposed and gray-blue in the flat spring light. He had brought the lab report. He had carried a copy of it in his desk drawer for 7 years. He was not entirely sure why, and when he cleaned out his desk in December, he had put it in a folder that he brought home and that sat on his kitchen counter for 3 months until he drove to Harlan County. He stood at the rim and held the report in his hands without reading it, because he had the numbers memorized and always would. 0.07, 0.9, 16. 3 numbers that described what was under his feet in a way that was accurate and complete, and that had not been known to anyone with the authority to act on them until the winter of 2010 had made the knowing urgent. Ruth Alderman had known it, or rather, she had trusted a record that knew it. She had trusted her father's careful block letters and his patient observations and his precise and unpretentious understanding that the stone did not need to be explained, only attended to. Cross folded the report and put it in his jacket pocket. He stood for a while longer at the rim. A pair of herons was working the shallow end of the water at the south wall, moving with the deliberate patience that herons have, which is the patience of things that do not rush, because they understand that their method will eventually yield what they are looking for. He watched them for a few minutes. Then he walked back to the car and drove home. Whoa! The 6 green ledgers sit in acid-free boxes in the Harlan County Historical Society's archive room in a building that was a hardware store in the 1930s and a law office in the 1970s and has been the Historical Society since 1998. The boxes are stored on metal shelves in a climate-controlled room with a dehumidifier that runs quietly in the corner. Anyone who wants to read the ledgers can read them. You call the society and make an appointment, and they bring the boxes out to a reading room table, and you sit with them, and the archivist brings you cotton gloves and reminds you not to rest your elbows on the pages. The pages are in excellent condition, as Sarah Dunmore noted when she catalogued them. The dark green leather is still supple. The gold leaf on the spines is mostly gone, but the pressed impressions remain, the dates still readable if you angle the spine toward the light. The block letters inside are clear and consistent from the first volume to the 6th, 70-year-old ink on acid-free paper that Victor Alderman had ordered from a catalog in Pittsburgh because he had decided to keep records and had decided as a consequence of that decision to use materials that would last. The final entry in the 6th ledger, dated October 29, 1971, reads, "Shutting down the crusher for winter. Consolidated Aggregates of Lee County has underbid us again for the state contracts. Their stone is limestone. It is cheap, and it will work adequately for some years under moderate conditions. It will not work under the worst conditions this county can produce. The state has chosen to believe that the worst conditions are not the measure of a material. They are wrong. They will discover they are wrong eventually, though perhaps not for some years. I have noted it here. The deposit is intact and will remain intact. The stone does not change. The stone is not diminished by the choice that has been made. I am 73 years old. I have worked this land for 40 years. I know what is in it. I leave this record for whoever needs it." His name at the bottom of the entry, Victor Thomas Alderman. The ink slightly heavier on the signature than on the body of the text, as if he had pressed down a little harder, as if he wanted the name to last. It lasted. The stone lasted. The ledgers lasted. The knowledge lasted, carried first in Ruth Alderman's memory, and then in the record she had inherited and paid taxes on and bought back for $1,200 and held until a winter came that was cold enough and hard enough and long enough to prove what her father had known. What is rigid breaks. What is suited to its place endures. The iron-hearted granite was suited to the harsh winters of Harlan County, and the quiet inherited knowledge of the Alderman family was suited to the arrogance of data that mistakes the laboratory for the field and the chart for the ground. She just had to wait for the world to need what she already knew, and she was patient. She had learned patience from a man who had spent 40 years writing down the temperature and the depth of the cut and the hardness of the stone and the name of the client and the price, and then had noted in the last entry of the last ledger that the stone was not diminished. It was not. It never was.